January 17, 1991. Al-Taqaddum Air Base, Iraq. 3 a.m. local time. The desert night is a vast, cold void. On the tarmac, the shapes of Soviet-made MiG-29 Fulcrums are dark silhouettes against the starlight. These are not second-rate machines. They are among the most advanced fighter jets in the world, the pride of the Soviet VVS. Iraqi ground crews move with a tense urgency, checking systems, fueling aircraft. The pilots, trained in the Soviet Union, strap into their cockpits. They have a mission: intercept the first wave of the coalition air armada. Their sensors paint a terrifying picture. The radar scopes are a storm of false echoes and ghost returns. The sophisticated Soviet-designed friend or foe identification systems are useless, blinded by an electronic tempest they have never experienced. Communications crackle with panic and static. Then from the chaos, a clean, lethal signal emerges. 70 miles away, a U.S. Air Force F-15 Sea Eagle, cruising at 35,000 feet, locks its APG-63 radar onto a climbing MiG-29. In the glow of his cockpit, the American pilot sees not an aircraft but a target. The rules of engagement are clear. He receives confirmation. His finger depresses the trigger. A single AIM-7 Sparrow missile drops from its pylon, ignites and streaks into the blackness. The MiG-29 pilot never sees it coming. There is no dramatic dogfight, no twisting, turning duel of equals. Just a flash in the distance, then a fireball scattering debris across the Iraqi desert. The Fulcrum, a symbol of Soviet technological parity, is erased from the sky in seconds. In Moscow and in military institutes across the collapsing Soviet Union, officers watching CNN and intelligence feeds lean closer to their screens. Their coffee goes cold. A profound, unsettling silence descends. This is not just an Iraqi defeat. It is the shattering of a fundamental doctrine. The unthinkable is happening in real time. The sky, they are realizing with dawning horror, no longer belongs to them. The Cold War had been a tense stalemate, a balance of terror built on the assumption of relative technological equality. But in the deserts of Iraq, that assumption was about to be incinerated. To understand the magnitude of the shock felt in Moscow and the halls of the Soviet military, one must first grasp the bedrock of their strategic confidence. For over 4 decades, the world had been bipolar, defined by the tense equilibrium between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the realm of air power and air defense, this was not a story of American undisputed supremacy, but of a brutal, competitive dialectic. The Soviet air defense philosophy was not built around individual dogfighting aces, but on a vast, integrated system, a deeply layered network of radar coverage, surface-to-air missile (SAM), batteries, interceptor aircraft, and command centers. This system, known as the PVO Strany, was a sprawling technological ecosystem. Its purpose was to create an impenetrable shield over Soviet territory. From the iconic SA-2 guideline that downed Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960, to the mobile SA-6 Gainful that plagued Israeli jets in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Soviet SAM technology had proven itself deadly and adaptive. It forced the West into a relentless and expensive game of electronic and tactical countermeasures. In the air, the narrative was similarly complex. Soviet jet design, often under the legendary MiG Bureau, prioritized different metrics than Western counterparts: high-altitude interception, raw speed, climb rate, and simplicity for mass production. These were weapons designed for a specific, apocalyptic scenario, defending the motherland against waves of NATO bombers. The MiG-15 shocked American F-86 Sabres over Korea with its performance. Later, over the skies of North Vietnam, Soviet-designed MiG-17s and MiG-21s, flown by North Vietnamese pilots, proved more than a match for advanced U.S. aircraft in close-quarters combat, scoring kills against F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The lessons were clear. In a visual, turning fight, Soviet machines and the pilots trained in their doctrine could win. This experience culminated in the aircraft that sat on Iraqi runways in 1991, the MiG-29 Fulcrum and the Su-27 Flanker. To Soviet observers, these were not just equal to their Western rivals. In many respects, they were believed to be superior. The MiG-29, with its helmet-mounted sight and high off-bore sight R-73 Archer missile, promised a revolutionary close combat kill probability. Its look-down/shoot-down radar and agile airframe were answers to every perceived NATO advantage. For the Soviet military and its intelligence arm, the GRU, the balance of power in the air was at worst even, and at best, tipping in their favor due to these new fourth-generation fighters. This confidence was mirrored in the export client that became the ultimate test bed: Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq had become the world's largest importer of Soviet military hardware. By 1990, the Iraqi Air Force IRAF boasted over 700 combat aircraft, including dozens of MiG-29s, advanced MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors, and Su-24 Fencer bombers. Its air defense network was a meticulous copy of the Soviet model, a dense, overlapping web of early warning radars, French and Soviet command systems, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns and SAM launchers, including the latest SA-6 and SA-8 batteries. It was considered one of the most formidable integrated air defense systems (IADS) outside of the Warsaw Pact itself. For Soviet tacticians, the impending confrontation in the Gulf was not a foregone conclusion. It was to be the ultimate validation of their exported technology and doctrine against the West's best, on a battlefield of their clients' choosing. Yet, this formidable facade concealed critical and ultimately fatal cracks that American planners had spent 2 decades meticulously identifying and engineering tools to exploit. The American response to the Soviet air defense challenge was born not of mirror image competition, but of a fundamentally different philosophy. While the USSR built a vast, centralized system, the US invested in a revolution of asymmetry. The trauma of Vietnam, where pilots flew into the teeth of that Soviet-style SAM network, served as a brutal catalyst. The lesson was not to build a better MiG, but to render the entire Soviet system obsolete. This effort coalesced into a secretive long-term strategy with 2 intertwined pillars: stealth and electronic warfare. The Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, operational since 1983, was its most radical expression. Its faceted design, a product of mathematical formulas for radar deflection, was not merely an aircraft, it was a physical manifesto. It declared that the foundational element of the Soviet IADS, radar detection, could be made irrelevant. Flying its first combat mission over Panama in 1989, its true purpose was always the penetration of the dense, Soviet-style defenses now arrayed in Iraq. But stealth was only one blade of the scissors. The other was a profound dominance in the electromagnetic spectrum. The U.S. Navy's E-6B Prowler and the Air Force's EF-111A Raven were flying electronic fortresses. Their mission was not destruction, but deception and domination. They could jam early warning radars, spoof missile guidance signals, and inject phantom targets into enemy networks. This electronic onslaught was amplified by dedicated suppression platforms like the F-4G Wild Weasel, armed with anti-radiation missiles designed to hunt SAM sites by homing in on their very radar emissions. The strategy was systemic: blind the eyes, deafen the ears, and then methodically dismantle the nervous system of the air defense network. The fighter meant to rule the cleansed sky was the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. Introduced in 1976, it was built around a single uncompromising premise: not a pound for air-to-ground. It was a pure air superiority weapon. Its APG-63 radar was the most powerful in any fighter cockpit, capable of tracking small high-speed targets at long range. Its weapons, the AIM-7F/M Sparrow and the new AIM-120 AMRAAM, provided beyond visual range (BVR) kill capability. Its 2-engine thrust-to-weight ratio granted it crushing energy dominance. In exercises against U.S. Air Force F-4s and F-100s AXS simulating MiGs, the Eagles achieved kill ratios that seemed fictional, often exceeding 30-1. But these were simulations. A nagging question remained: how would it fare against the latest real MiGs flown by combat pilots, within a fully operational IADS? The stage for this answer was set by a geopolitical earthquake. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. The international coalition that formed in response, led by the United States, presented a unique and urgent opportunity. For American war planners, the objective was clear: liberate Kuwait. But for the strategic thinkers at the Pentagon and within the intelligence community, Operation Desert Storm presented a second, unparalleled objective. It was a chance to conduct a live-fire, full-scale test of their 2-decade investment in counter-Soviet technology and doctrine. The Iraqi military was, for all intents and purposes, a Soviet proxy force. Its equipment was Soviet. Its training was Soviet. Its defensive plans were Soviet. The upcoming air war would be the closest possible simulation of a long-dreaded clash over the Fulda Gap, but without the risk of nuclear escalation. As the UN deadline of January 15, 1991, approached, hundreds of advanced U.S. aircraft flowed into bases in Saudi Arabia and carriers in the Persian Gulf. They were supported by a vast, theater-wide web of airborne command posts, AWACS, tankers and reconnaissance platforms. In the Pentagon, planners finalized the Air Tasking Order, a single, intricate blueprint for the systematic annihilation of Iraqi military capability. In Moscow, Soviet advisors who had helped build the Iraqi defense system watched nervously. Their client was confident, even defiant. But they understood the scale of the force gathering across the border. A deep, professional curiosity was laced with an undercurrent of dread. They were about to witness their own doctrine, their own technology, face an opponent that had spent a generation preparing for this exact fight. On the eve of battle, two visions of aerial warfare stood poised for collision. One of integrated defense, the other of systemic disintegration. The first shots would reveal which vision understood the future. The cockpit of a MiG-29 is a testament to Soviet engineering philosophy. Functional, purposeful, built around the machine's formidable performance. The pilot is an integral component of the weapon system, but the flow of information is channeled, deliberate. He relies on his ground controller for vectoring, his onboard radar for a limited forward cone of awareness, and his eyes for the final kill. His training emphasizes disciplined formation flying, ground-controlled intercepts, and close-in visual combat where the fulcrum's agility and helmet-mounted sight are decisive. This was the pinnacle of the Soviet pilot paradigm, honed over decades. Contrast this with the reality he faced in the early hours of January 17. Instead of a clear vector towards a target, his radio dissolved into a cacophony of jamming, a harsh, screeching blanket of noise. His radar scope, normally a tool for hunting, became a useless orb of flickering chaos, swamped by false targets and spoofed signals injected by American EF-111s and IS-6Bs. The data link from his ground control station went silent, severed by precision strikes on communication nodes. In moments, he was transformed from a guided interceptor into a blind, deaf and isolated man in a metal tube, hurtling through a darkened sky that belonged to someone else. 70 miles away, the American F-15 pilot exists in a different informational universe. His cockpit is not a solitary cell, but a node in a vast real-time network. The radar picture he sees is synthesized and clarified by the E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft circling safely behind the border. The AWACS controller, seeing the entire battle space, speaks calmly into his headset, "Bandits, bullseye 270 for 70, Angels 25 hot." The F-15's own powerful radar confirms the track. The pilot sees not just a blip, but an identified track, fulcrum, with speed, altitude and heading. He is not hunting. He is prosecuting. The disparity is not merely technological, it is cognitive and psychological. The Soviet-trained pilot is overwhelmed, operating on degraded or non-existent information, forced into reaction. The American pilot is empowered, operating with near-total situational awareness, executing a plan. The kill, when it comes via a long-range AIM-7 Sparrow, is a clinical conclusion to a process the MiG pilot scarcely comprehended. He is not outflown in a dogfight. He is outthought and out-networked by a system that has already won the battle before he ever took off. The human courage and skill on both sides are undeniable, but they are rendered almost incidental by the gulf between their respective information environments. This fundamental shift, from the pilot as a glorified gunner to the pilot as a manager of overwhelming information, represented a quiet revolution in warfare, one the Soviet observers grasped with chilling clarity. Soviet air defense doctrine was architectural. It was built like a fortress, with layers of mutually supporting systems. Outer early warning radars would detect the strike package. Command centers would vector interceptor aircraft and assign targets to SAM batteries. The SAM sites, protected by anti-aircraft artillery, would engage, creating a lethal kill box, through which attackers would have to fly. The system's strength was its interdependence, its redundancy. Or so the theory went. Operation Desert Storm opened not with a wave of bombers, but with a symphony of suppression. The first fixed-wing aircraft to cross into Iraqi airspace was not an F-15 or an F-16, but an Army AH-64 Apache helicopter, firing Hellfire missiles to destroy two critical early warning radar sites on the border, punching a hole in the outer wall of the fortress. As this hole opened, the F-117A Nighthawks, invisible to radar, flowed through it. Their targets were not airfields or tanks, but the brainstems of the IADS, the hardened command and control bunkers in Baghdad, and the critical linkages between radar and missile sites. Simultaneously, a tidal wave of electronic noise crashed over the entire Iraqi electromagnetic spectrum. Dozens of specialized jamming aircraft created a corridor of electronic chaos, within which conventional strike packages could operate with relative impunity. 4 Iraqi radar operators, Their screens erupted in sparkle, countless false targets. Communications between sectors were jammed or severed by precision munitions. The integrated network was systematically disintegrated, broken down into isolated, blinded, and deafened pockets. Then came the hunters. F-4G wild weasels, their sensitive noses tuned to the specific frequencies of Iraqi SAM radars, prowled these corridors. The moment a desperate SA-6 or SA-8 site activated its radar to try and find a target, it committed suicide. The weasel would lock onto the radiation source and fire an AGM-88 HARM high-speed anti-radiation missile that would race down the radar beam, destroying the antenna and often the entire launch vehicle. The message to Iraqi air defenders was paralyzing. To turn on your radar was to die. The only alternative was to turn it off and thus be blind. Within 72 hours, the formidable Iraqi I-8S, a near replica of the Soviet model, was not merely damaged, it was cognitively destroyed. It could still launch sporadic, unguided shots, but its coordinated function had ceased. The sky was no longer contested space, it had become a permissive environment for coalition aircraft. For Soviet officers watching, this was not a tactical setback, it was an existential threat to their entire defensive paradigm. Their fortress had been dismantled not by siege, but by a masterful combination of deception, precision, and systemic targeting that they had never truly envisioned. The terrifying lesson was that the Soviets had built a magnificent system for the last war, while the Americans had invented a new method of war altogether. The core of aerial combat had always been a brutal sequence: see, decide, fire. For generations, see meant the Mark I human eyeball, eventually aided by short-range radar. The Soviet solution, exemplified by the MiG-29, was to excel within that visual envelope. Its IRST infrared search and track system and helmet-mounted sight allowed the pilot to lock onto a target by simply looking at it, a revolutionary advantage in a close-range knife fight. Its R-73 AA-11 Archer missile could be slaved to the pilot's gaze and fired at extreme off-bore sight angles. In a dogfight under 1 mile, the Fulcrum was arguably unbeatable. But Desert Storm revealed a devastating truth: the dogfight was obsolete. The Americans had moved the decisive engagement zone from 1 mile to 20, from visual to beyond visual range (BVR). This shift was enabled by a crushing superiority in 3 areas: radar, avionics integration, and stealth. The F-15s and APG-63 pulse Doppler radar was a generation ahead of anything in the Soviet inventory. It could look down and distinguish a low-flying aircraft from the clutter of the ground, a critical capability Soviet radars struggled with. It could track multiple targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But the true advantage was not just the radar's power, but its fusion with other systems. The radar data was processed, filtered, and displayed on a clear, comprehensible screen. The pilot saw an ordered battlespace, with friendlies identified via secure IFF, identification friend or foe, and hostiles tagged. He could fire an AIM-7 Sparrow, and later the Fire and Forget AIM-120 AMRAAM, based on that radar picture alone, long before either pilot could see the other. Stealth, as embodied by the F-117, was the ultimate expression of this technological asymmetry. It didn't just reduce detection range, it collapsed the enemy's decision-making timeline to 0. An Iraqi SA-3 site might detect a conventional aircraft at 30 miles, giving its crew minutes to track, compute a solution, and fire. The F-117, with its radar cross-section smaller than a bird, would not be detected until it was perhaps 10 miles away, if at all. By the time the defender realized he was under attack, the bomb was already guiding through the ventilation shaft of his command bunker. For Soviet analysts, stealth was not merely a new technology, it was a negation of physics as their sensors understood it. This created an insurmountable first look, first shot, first kill advantage. The MiG-29 pilot, trained to close to visual range to unleash his superior close combat weapons, was a sitting duck in the BVR arena. He was detected, targeted, and engaged before his own sensors could even provide a firing solution. The vaunted Archer missile, deadly within a mile, was useless. The technological chasm rendered the Fulcrum's greatest strengths irrelevant, transforming it from a predator into prey. The horror for Soviet observers was the realization that they had been competing in the wrong race. They had built a faster, more agile horse, while the Americans had built an internal combustion engine. The contrast in military leadership and institutional culture between the US and Soviet systems was as decisive as any missile. The American approach that triumphed in Desert Storm was the product of a specific, painful evolution. After the doctrinal failures and Institutional trauma of Vietnam. The U.S. military underwent a ruthless period of self-examination. The creation of Top Gun, the development of red flag exercises that simulated dense enemy IADS, and the birth of the Checkmate Planning Cell were all symptoms of a culture that valued brutal honesty, tactical innovation, and decentralized execution. The airland battle doctrine of the 1980s emphasized initiative, agility, and deep strikes to disrupt the enemy system as a whole. This culture empowered the officers planning Desert Storm. General Chuck Horner and his chief planner, Lieutenant Colonel David Depschala, conceived of a strategic air campaign from the outset, targeting Iraq's centers of gravity, leadership, electricity, air defense, in a parallel, not sequential, fashion. They wielded the joint force with a flexibility the rigid Soviet system could not comprehend. A Navy Tomahawk missile could hit a target coordinated by an Air Force AWACS, which was protecting an Army Apache helicopter. This jointness was chaotic on paper but devastatingly effective in practice, because it was built on a foundation of shared data and trust in subordinate initiative. The Soviet system, by stark contrast, was hierarchical, centralized, and inflexible. Doctrine was dogma handed down from the general staff. Initiative was discouraged. Deviation from the plan was a failure. The system was designed for a massive, predictable linear war in Central Europe, not for adaptive warfare against a technologically creative foe. This institutional paralysis was mirrored perfectly in its exported form in Iraq. The Iraqi Air Force was trained to follow Soviet-style ground-controlled intercepts to the letter. When those ground controllers were killed or silenced, the pilots had no fallback doctrine, no training for independent action. They were components of a machine that had broken down. Furthermore, the Soviet military-industrial complex was sclerotic. Innovations like phased array radars, secure data links, and truly integrated avionics suites were mired in bureaucracy, interbureau rivalries, and a production-focused system that prized quantity over quality upgrades. While the U.S. was iterating software and radar upgrades every few years, Soviet systems were frozen in their initial design for a decade or more. The MiG-29 that flew in 1991 was essentially the same as the one that entered service in 1983, while the F-15s radar and weapons had undergone multiple revolutions. Watching Desert Storm, Soviet generals saw more than lost battles. They saw the failure of their entire institutional model. The Americans had won not just with better technology, but with a more adaptable, learning-oriented, and decentralized military culture. It was a leadership and doctrinal defeat that struck at the very soul of the Soviet officer corps, revealing that their greatest weakness was not in their workshops, but in their headquarters and their very way of thinking about war. The collapse of the Iraqi military was, therefore, a chilling proxy for a potential collapse of their own. It revealed that in the face of an adaptive, networked enemy, their magnificent, rigid machine was dangerously fragile. The turning point was not a single battle, but a rapid, cascading sequence of events in the war's first 72 hours that transformed theoretical American advantages into irrefutable, catastrophic reality for the Iraqi, and by proxy, the Soviet, Air Force. It was the moment the system of systems proved its lethality, moving from the planner's blueprints into the realm of historical fact. At 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time on January 17, the horizon to the south lit up with the streaks of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Moments later, the first fixed-wing strike packages, led by the ghostly F-117s, crossed the border. The Iraqi IADS, on high alert, reacted as it was designed to do. Radar spun up, painting the sky. SAM site commanders awaited target assignments. Interceptor squadrons, including the prized MiG-29s, were scrambled from bases like Al-Taqaddum and Qadisiyah. But the expected picture of a massed bomber stream never materialized on their scopes. Instead, operators saw chaos. American EA-6B Prowlers and EF-111 Ravens, orbiting just outside missile range, unleashed a torrent of focused jamming. Screens dissolved into white noise, or filled with hundreds of false, hopping targets. A technique called gate stealing that made it impossible to distinguish real aircraft from electronic phantoms. Communications between sectors crackled and died under the strain. The integrated network began to fracture into isolated, confused cells. It was into this fractured awareness that the first aerial kills occurred. A pair of U.S. Navy F/A-18 Hornets, part of a strike package, were north of the border when their AWACS controller alerted them to bandits approaching from the east. A section of MiG-21 scrambled from Al-Taqaddum. The Hornet pilots, their radars filtering through the jamming with superior processing, locked on and fired AIM-7 Sparrows. One MiG-21 vanished in a fireball, the other, damaged, limped away. It was a clean BVR kill. The MiG pilots likely never saw their attackers. Simultaneously, the F-117s glided unseen into the heart of the network. Their laser-guided bombs detonated with pinpoint accuracy on the key air defense command bunkers in Baghdad. The physical brains of the IADS were being physically destroyed, even as its sensory organs were being electronically blinded. As dawn broke on the 17th, the scale of the electronic and physical devastation became apparent to Iraqi Air Force commanders. In a desperate bid to regain some initiative and preserve their force, they ordered a significant portion of their advanced fighters to disperse to hardened aircraft shelters, HAZ, at major bases and to secondary airfields. This was a standard Soviet survival tactic. But the coalition's intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance ISR web was omnipresent. Real-time imagery from satellites and drones, combined with signals intelligence, tracked these movements. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A massive wave of strike aircraft, F-111s, F-15es, F-16s and A-6 intruders, swarmed over the Iraqi airfields. They were not just cratering runways, they were systematically destroying the HAZ themselves with specialized hardened penetrator bombs like the 2,000-pound GBU-10 and GBU-27, dropped by laser-guided F-111FS and F-117s. For Iraqi ground crews and pilots, the ground itself became a death trap. Taxiing aircraft were hit by cluster munitions. Shelters believed to be impregnable were cracked open like eggs. The aircraft inside melted into scrap. The air superiority fighters, the F-15cs, now began their relentless patrols, dubbed MiG sweeps, along likely ingress routes. Their mission was clear: establish total dominance and kill anything that tried to fly. That afternoon, a flight of 4 F-15cs of the 1st Fighter Wing, call sign Citgo, patrolling near the Syrian border, received a vector from AWACS. Multiple bandits were airborne to the east. The Eagles turned, their radars sweeping. The lead pilot, Captain John J.B. Kelk, acquired 2 contacts at long range, descending and accelerating. They were MiG-29 Fulcrums, likely trying to escape to Iran. The engagement was a clinic in the new paradigm. The F-15s maintained formation, sharing data. At a range of over 20 miles, well beyond visual contact, Kelk fired an AIM-7 Sparrow. It guided true, striking the lead MiG-29 and blowing it apart. The second Fulcrum, piloted by Captain Jamil Sayhoud, broke hard, but another Eagle, piloted by Captain Robert Hieman, fired a second Sparrow. It missed, but the MiG was now defensive and low on energy. Hieman closed to visual range, identified the distinct silhouette of the Fulcrum, and finished it with an AIM-9 Sidewinder. 2 of Iraq's most advanced fighters were gone in minutes, their pilots ejecting over hostile territory. The kills were confirmed by gun camera footage and AWACS tapes, irrefutable evidence of the F-15's lethality. By nightfall on January 17, the Iraqi Air Force was reeling. Its command system was gutted, its airfields were under siege, and its myth of technological parity with the West had been shattered in the cold, methodical calculus of beyond visual range missile shots. But the true climax of its destruction, and the moment that would cement the horror for Soviet observers, was still to come: a mass exodus that became a turkey shoot. The decisive, soul-crushing climax of the air war occurred not in a daring dogfight, but in a panicked retreat. By January 26, 1991, the Iraqi Air Force High Command faced an undeniable truth: to stay on the ground was to be destroyed in its shelters, to fly was to be hunted and killed. In a desperate bid for survival, Saddam Hussein issued a fateful order: evacuate the bulk of the modern combat aircraft to Iran, a neutral but hostile neighbor. It was a move born of strategic bankruptcy, turning the world's 6th largest air force into a fleet of refugees. Coalition ISR assets detected the mass movement immediately. AWACS controllers saw the blips lifting off from airfields across Iraq, not forming for combat, but turning due east, flying low and fast. The signal was unmistakable: they were running. For the F-15C pilots patrolling the MiG-cap stations along the Iranian border, this was the moment they had trained for their entire careers. The fleeing Iraqi jets, MiG-29s, MiG-25s, Su-24s, Su-20s and Mirage F-1s, were not maneuvering tactically. They were flying straight-line profiles, overloaded with fuel and sometimes spare parts, their pilots focused on navigation, not combat. They were not hunters but prey caught in the open. What followed was one of the most lopsided aerial massacres in the history of jet combat, a day that would later be grimly nicknamed the Great Turkey Shoot, or the Bekaa Valley on a continental scale. referencing Israel's 1982 decimation of the Syrian Air Force. As the Iraqi streams approached the border, flights of F-15s, vectored seamlessly by AWACS, swooped in. The engagements were brutal in their efficiency. On January 27, a flight of F-15s from the 53rd Tactical Fighter Squadron engaged a group of 4 MiG-23 floggers. From over 20 miles away, Captain Rory Hoser Drager fired an AM-7 at a MiG-23 The missile found its mark. Minutes later, his wingman, Captain Charles Chappell McGill, engaged another flogger with an AIM-9 Sidewinder, sending it spiraling into the desert. The remaining 2 fled, only to be chased down and destroyed. But the symbolic kill of the Exodus, the one that would be replayed endlessly in Soviet assessment halls, came on January 19, just as the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. 2 F-15CS from the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron, piloted by Captain Thomas T.K. Dietz and Lieutenant Robert Boris Heeman, were patrolling near the Iranian border. AWACS called out a high-speed, high-altitude target approaching from the west. It was a solitary MiG-25RB Foxbat, the legendary reconnaissance/strike variant of the world's fastest operational interceptor. In Soviet service, it was a symbol of technological reach and impunity, designed to streak in at Mach 3, drop its bombs, and outrun any threat. This Foxbat pilot was trying to do just that, run. He was at over 40,000 feet, pushing his twin Tamansky engines to their limit. In a previous era he would have been untouchable. Dietz, in his F-15, pulled into a steep climb, a zoom maneuver trading airspeed for altitude. His APG-63 radar maintained lock through the extreme conditions. At the edge of the missile envelope, he fired an AIM-7M Sparrow. The missile climbed, corkscrewed, and arced toward the speeding Foxbat. Against all odds it connected. A fireball erupted against the blue sky at the very edge of space, and the wreckage of the world's fastest combat jet tumbled into the Persian Gulf. The kill was a physical demonstration of a new principle. Raw speed was no longer a sanctuary. American radar and missile guidance technology could now reach out and kill even the most elusive targets. Over the course of a week, this slaughter of the fleeing continued. At least 115 Iraqi aircraft fled to Iran, where they were impounded for the duration of the war, a total write-off. But dozens more were shot down trying to get there. The final toll was catastrophic. The Iraqi Air Force effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. It suffered over 40 confirmed aerial losses, the vast majority to F-15s, and lost hundreds more on the ground. Not a single coalition aircraft was lost in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio was infinite. 4 Soviet pilots and tacticians monitoring the conflict. This was the horrifying climax. It wasn't just that their equipment lost. It was the manner of the loss. The exodus to Iran was a move straight out of the Soviet survival playbook for a conventional war. Yet, when executed against the American system, it resulted not in preservation but in annihilation. The Foxbat, a symbol of Soviet high-speed supremacy, was shot down in a profile it was built to survive. The MiG-29, their champion, was killed with cold, procedural detachment before it could ever use its legendary close combat prowess. The integrated air defense, their proudest export, was dismantled like a cheap watch. The guns fell silent in the Kuwaiti theater by late February 1991, but the shockwaves from the air campaign reverberated through the corridors of the Soviet and then Russian military establishment with the force of a seismic event. The immediate aftermath was a period of profound, institutional disorientation, followed by a painful and divisive scramble for understanding. Initial Soviet official reactions were a mixture of denial, deflection, and suppressed alarm. Public statements from the Ministry of Defense downplayed the performance of American technology, attributing the Iraqi defeat to poor training, low morale, and the unexpected scale of the coalition effort. They pointed to isolated instances of Iraqi SAM kills, like the downing of an F/A-18 and an F-16, as proof that their systems could work. Privately, however, a different conversation was raging. A classified report compiled by the main intelligence directorate (GRU) and the Soviet Air Force in mid-1991 laid bare the truth. It concluded that the U.S. had achieved a qualitative military technical leap that had devalued the core principles of our air and air defense forces. The report highlighted the F-15's radar superiority, the crushing effectiveness of coalition SAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, and the revolutionary impact of stealth as asymmetrical advantages for which we have no current answer. The human impact on the Soviet military psyche was profound. Veteran pilots who had served in Afghanistan, men who believed in the capability of their MiGs and SUs, watched the gun camera footage and AWACS reconstructions with a sense of personal and professional violation. Colonel Alexander Rutskoy, a decorated Afghan war veteran and future vice president of Russia, spoke for many when he later said, "We saw our own potential fate on those tapes. It was not that the Iraqis were cowards. It was that they never had a chance. And if they had no chance, what did that mean for us?" The confidence that had underpinned decades of tactical planning evaporated. The once respected threat of the Soviet IADS was now seen in the West as a manageable problem, a known system that could be defeated. This crisis of faith arrived at the worst possible moment, the simultaneous political and economic collapse of the Soviet Union itself. As the USSR dissolved in December 1991, the once mighty Red Army fractured into the militaries of new states, primarily the Russian Federation. Funding evaporated. The vast assembly lines that produced MiGs and SAM systems slowed to a trickle. The brain drain of scientists and engineers accelerated. The military was left with a double burden: the existential shock of Desert Storm and the material reality of a country in freefall. In this vacuum, a fierce doctrinal war erupted within the Russian General Staff. One faction, the traditionalists, argued that Desert Storm was an anomaly, a desert conflict against a mediocre client state that did not reflect the true strength of a homeland defense fought over familiar terrain with full mobilization. They advocated for doubling down on existing systems, producing more advanced variants of the MiG-29 and Su-27, and refining, not abandoning, the integrated air defense concept. The other faction, the reformers, often younger officers and analysts, saw a different future. Led by forward thinkers like General Vladimir Slipchenko, they began developing theories of sixth-generation warfare, or network-centric warfare, essentially trying to reverse-engineer the American model. They argued for a desperate leap: invest not in more platforms but in the connective tissue, secure data links, airborne early warning aircraft, like the Doomsday 50 project, precision-guided munitions and electronic warfare suites that could compete with the American standard. They understood that the real defeat was in command, control, communications and intelligence, C3I. The problem was that realizing this vision required money, technological infrastructure and time, none of which Russia had in the 1990s. The 1990s became a lost decade for Russian air power, a period of agonizing stagnation where the lessons of Desert Storm were understood but impossible to act upon. The Russian Air Force (VVS) and Air Defense Forces (PVO) withered. Flight hours for pilots plummeted to a fraction of NATO standards, sometimes as low as 20 to 30 hours per year, turning even experienced aviators into dangerously rusty operators. The vast network of early warning radars along the periphery began to fail, creating gaps in coverage. Modernization programs for the MiG-29 and Su-27, like the MiG-29 SMT and Su-27 SM, proceeded at a glacial pace, producing only handfuls of updated aircraft. The dream of a Russian AWACS fleet or a stealth fighter remained a drawing board fantasy. Yet the shock of 1991 never faded. It became the central trauma around which a new, more pragmatic and asymmetrical Russian military doctrine would eventually coalesce under Vladimir Putin's presidency and the influx of oil and gas revenue in the early 2000s. The reformist faction's arguments, though delayed, began to shape a new approach. If Russia could not hope to match the US in a head-to-head, large-scale conflict of pure technological attrition, it would have to find ways to undermine the American system of systems. This led to two parallel investment tracks. First, a focused modernization of legacy platforms with selected 21st-century capabilities. The Su-27 evolved into the formidable Su-30SM and Su-35S, aircraft that integrated advanced digital fly-by-wire, powerful Urbisi passive electronically scanned array, PESA, radars and the long-range R-77 AA-12 Adder missile, a rough analog to the AIM-120 AMRAAM. These were not mere copies, but innovative designs that leveraged classic Soviet strengths: supermaneuverability, powerful engines, while grafting on improved sensors and data sharing. The goal was to create a counter-networked node, a platform that could operate with some autonomy if the wider network was degraded. Second, and more critically, Russia invested heavily in the very systems that had dismantled the Iraqi IADS, electronic warfare (EW), and long-range standoff strike. The lessons of the EF-111 and the HARM missile were taken to heart. Systems like the Krasuka and Murmansk BN-EW complexes were developed to jam AWACS, satellite communications and GPS signals over hundreds of kilometers, aiming to create localized bubbles of electronic denial to blind the network. The S-300 and later S-400 Triumph air defense systems, while still part of an integrated network, were designed with greater mobility, autonomy, and resistance to jamming. They were answers to the SEAD threat, meant to shoot down not just aircraft, but the anti-radiation missiles fired at them. Most revealing was the shift in strategic posture. Having witnessed the F-117's surgical decapitation strikes, Russia poured resources into its own long-range precision strike cruise missiles like the Kh-101 and the Caliber family. The doctrine of strategic operation for the destruction of critically important targets, honed in Syria from 2015 onward, is a direct, mirror-image response to the opening nights of Desert Storm. It prioritizes the early, massed use of cruise missiles and unmanned systems to strike enemy command centers, airfields, and electricity grids, to disintegrate an adversary's system from the outset, just as the U.S. had done. The human legacy is equally stark. A generation of Russian commanders, from Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov down, are Desert Storm veterans only in the intellectual sense. They studied it as cadets and junior officers. Its lessons form the bedrock of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which emphasizes the blurring of war and peace, and the use of non-military and asymmetrical tools to disrupt an adversary's cohesion before a shot is fired, a recognition that a purely conventional fight against a networked foe is suicidal. For the United States, the aftermath was one of confirmed dominance, but also of planted seeds for future conflict. The overwhelming success bred a certain hubris, a belief in the inevitability of full-spectrum dominance. It validated the investment in stealth, leading directly to the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II programs. However, it also convinced a potential adversary that direct confrontation was folly, prompting the very investments in EW, cyber, and asymmetric capabilities that now define the modern threat environment. The U.S. had won the battle so decisively that it forced its rivals to abandon the battlefield entirely and devise a new, more shadowy form of warfare. The desert skies of 1991, therefore, did not mark an end, but a violent rebirth. They ended the era of symmetrical force-on-force Cold War aerial combat and inaugurated a new, more complex and electronically opaque age of warfare, where dominance is contested not just in the air, but in the spectrum and in the mind. The desert wind eventually scours all traces of conflict from the sand. The shattered hulls of MiG-29s and the scorched earth of SAM sites are buried or reclaimed. But the silent, seismic shock transmitted from those sands to Moscow in 1991 left a permanent fissure in the bedrock of modern warfare. Operation Desert Storm's air campaign was more than a military victory, it was a historical hinge point. It marked the definitive end of the industrial age war of mass and maneuver, symbolized by the Soviet model, and the unequivocal dawn of the information age war of cognition and systems. The true weapon was not the F-15 or the stealth fighter alone, but the invisible web that connected them, the network of satellites, jammers, AWACS, and computers that created a shared, clear picture of the battlefield for one side, while plunging the other into a fog of deafening noise and disorienting deception. For the Soviet and then Russian observers, the horror was not merely in the loss of a client state's air force. It was in the chilling empirical proof that their entire paradigm, a paradigm built on courage, centralized control, massed armor, and layered defense, had been surgically bypassed. They witnessed their greatest strengths rendered irrelevant before they could be applied. The pilot's skill, the interceptor's speed, the SAM battery's reach, all were neutralized by an adversary who fought not at the level of platforms, but at the level of the system itself. It was a defeat of ideas. This realization did not lead to surrender, but to a profound and dangerous metamorphosis. Unable to replicate the American network-centric model in full, Russia embarked on a path to develop its own asymmetrical antidotes. Tools to blind the network, to distort its information, to strike its nodes from afar. The electronic warfare complexes, the long-range cruise missiles, the investment in cyber and informational conflict that define the modern Russian threat landscape are all, in essence, the direct progeny of the trauma of 1991. They are attempts to fight the network without owning it, to achieve disruption where dominance is impossible. Thus, the legacy of those horrified Soviet pilots and analysts is not confined to history books. It echoes in the static over Ukrainian battlefields where GPS signals fail, in the flight paths of Caliber missiles over Syria, and in the silent, digital shadows of cyber operations worldwide. The war they witnessed taught the world that supreme advantage is transient, that today's revolution in military affairs becomes tomorrow's baseline, and that a defeated doctrine will adapt into forms more elusive and complex. The sky over the desert in 1991 was cleared of opponents in a display of staggering dominance. But in clearing that sky, the victors inadvertently seeded the next conflict in a darker, more diffuse domain. A domain where visibility is never guaranteed, and where the lessons of loss are weaponized with patient, relentless intent. The final lesson of that total air dominance was a paradoxical one. The absolute victory of one era invariably plants the stubborn, resilient seeds of challenge for the next.